We've been doing this series, Bad Things Can Make Good Relationships. And we've talked about how when it helps to be angry, because anger is like a red flag, letting you know that there's something wrong and there's an emotion underneath that that's making you angry. And if we can discover that emotion and share it with those we love, we can begin to heal relationships. We talked about how it's helpful to be unforgiving, and that God doesn't just expect us to blanketly forgive everyone, even if they keep on hurting us. And we also talked about when it's helpful to confront. How when someone is hurting you, there's a specific command and a procedure that Christ gives us and how to confront others. Well, this morning I want to talk about when it helps to discriminate. And I'm not just talking about the kind of discrimination that's illegal, discriminating against someone because of their race or their religion. Those types of discrimination are horrible and we shouldn't be involved in them. Now, the type of discrimination I'm talking about is being discriminating in our relationships. I think it's important that in our relationships we be discriminating. And I define discrimination as careful inspection. We need to look carefully at our relationships and the folks that we are involved in relationship with so that we can continue to have healthy relationships and live a healthy life. Jesus said, carefully weigh and examine what people tell you. In 1884, a young man died suddenly and his family was crushed. And after a while, they decided that to memorialize their son's life, they wanted to build a building at Princeton University in his name. And so they went to Princeton University and met with the president, who was Charles Stanley at that time, and they said, Charles Eliot, and they said, we'd like to build a building at Princeton in our son's honor. Well, this couple was a very humble-looking couple, and they were from California, which in 1884 was still the Wild West. And the president of Princeton looked at them and decided that there was no way that they were going to be able to afford a building at Princeton. And he said, are you sure you don't just want to have a scholarship in memory of your son? And they said, oh, no, we'd like to have a building. And the president said, look, buildings are expensive, and we ask those who build buildings at our university to help with their continuing maintenance. I just don't know that that's something that you can do. And he dismissed them, and they didn't give up. They kept trying, and they came back several times over the course of the month. And each time he turned them down. Well, Charles Eliot found out a few years later that that family had, in fact, built a university building in memory of their son. It's called the Leland Stanford Junior University. They donated $26 million in 1884. We're talking about real money. Charles Eliot should have more carefully discriminated these folks before he dismissed them. Well, so why do we need to be discriminating? In Matthew 7, Jesus is referring to false prophets, but I think he's also talking about other relationships that we have. I think his wisdom can be used to help us deal with folks in our life that are causing us trouble. In these three verses, I think there are three ways that we can discriminate that helps us. First, discrimination protects against heartache. Discrimination protects against heartache. There are three different kinds of heartache that I want to talk about, and I didn't have enough room in the outline, so you might want to fill these in that gigantic space below. First, I think it helps us protect against heartache from false friends. Not everyone who wants to be our friend has our best in mind. And sometimes they're out to hurt us. When I first took the call to St. John's Presbyterian Church in Reno, the pastor had been removed for what they called administrative style. That means they couldn't catch him doing anything bad, but they knew he was doing some bad stuff. Now, some of the folks were happy when he was removed, but not everyone was. Some folks were upset that he was removed. They either didn't know what he was doing or didn't care what he was doing, and so they left the church, but not all of them. My first day on the job, about noon, a woman came into my office and she said, I'm the chair of the Christian Education Committee, and that's part of your job responsibility. I'd like to take you to lunch so that we can talk about that. I said, oh, that's wonderful. And she took me to a really, really nice restaurant. And she began telling me stories. And these stories were about the previous pastor, how wonderful he was and how much he had helped her. And at the end of every story, she said, "Don't you think that's just a terrible thing to do to a pastor of our church?" Now, I was very young and stupid, and what I said in response was, well, it appears that the presbytery doesn't just remove people for no reason at all. I don't know really what's been happening, and I'll have to look a little further in the situation before I make any judgments. Wrong answer. Because she spent the next 2.5 years doing to me what she was complaining that other people had done to her previous pastor. She was a false friend. Discrimination can also protect us from the heartache from false lovers. Not everyone who expresses love for us has our best interests at heart. They can look like friends or lovers, but they're users. They prey on us for our affection, for our money, or for our power. The third thing that discrimination protects against is it protects against heartache from the bad seed. Some parents can't see their children for who they really are. I did youth ministry for 20 years, and if I had a buck for every time some parents came into my office aghast at what they had discovered that their children were involved in, I could be driving a really nice car. And I decided relatively early on in my youth ministry that it would be good for me if I saw a kid who was involved in a behavior or an activity that was detrimental, that it would be good for me to go to the parents and warn them about this. Bad choice. Most parents, I discovered, didn't want to hear anything bad about their children. They would rather beat up on the youth pastor instead. But kids are problematic. Some of our kids are really problematic. And if we discriminate appropriately, we can help to keep our lives more peaceful. It's imperative that all of us as parents have a realistic view of our kids. The second thing that discrimination helps is discrimination protects against predators. Jesus said they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Different from those who are selfish and want to take advantage of us, predators seek to destroy us for whatever reason. Some of them have a mental illness that requires help, even medication. But most of them are just plain evil. The problem for pastors and churches is that we often become the target of predators because we're supposed to be these wonderful, nice people who accept everyone and give everyone the opportunity for reconciliation and healing. And us pastor types are trained to be caring and loving and forgiving. But we know that there are many predators who enter churches for no other reason than to hurt and maim and destroy. When I was doing an interim in the Sacramento area, I discovered relatively early on that there was a gentleman who for 30 years had been the head usher. Nobody can remember voting him to be the head usher, but he was the head usher. And he would stand at the door every Sunday, and he would shake the hands of the men, and he would ogle the women. Now, the difficult thing about that for me as a pastor was, how do you prove that? You can't, videotape him. But he did help me out. One Sunday morning, he touched a woman in a very inappropriate way. And he was either good news or bad news, an elder in the church. And the Book of Order in the Presbyterian Church has some means for dealing with elders who hurt churches. So when we received a letter from the woman as to what he had done, the session called this gentleman in and said, look, we have 3 options for you. Option number 1, you get help and we'll even pay for the help that you get. Option number 2, if you don't choose to be helped, then we're going to start the disciplinary process so that you won't be doing this anymore in our church. Option number 3, if you don't like either of those 2, you can just leave the church and we'll be done with it. Thankfully, he chose option number 3. Tragically, he went down the street and tried to do the same thing at the church down the street, but I called the pastor and warned him. Discrimination helps against predators. There are folks who are out there who are seeking to destroy you. And we need to discriminate carefully so that we can avoid them. The third thing that discrimination does is discrimination protects against myopia. Jesus said, "By their fruit you will recognize them." Problem is sometimes we're just so happy going through life we don't discriminate carefully and we don't see the bad fruit from bad people. I grew up in Sacramento, California, and a couple of times a year, just about every year of my life, either my parents drove or I drove to Los Angeles, either to go to Disneyland or for some meeting. And you have to go down I-5, and it goes right through the Central Valley, and it's a long, straight drive. And I discovered that there's something you can do to help the time pass. It's one of the most fertile valleys in the entire world. 1/8 of the world's food is grown in the Central Valley of California. And the thing that I would do to pass time was, as you're going down the road at 70 miles an hour, we would try to guess what kind of tree or vegetable or fruit was being grown. The problem is at 70 miles an hour, it's tough to tell the difference between a peach and a nectarine. If you pull off the side of the road and inspect more carefully, you can begin to tell. The problem is most of us are going about 70 miles an hour through our lives, and we don't do careful inspection of the relationships around us, and we become myopic. Discrimination can help protect against that. Well, so what are the benefits of discrimination? I think there are 4 that Jesus talks about in this passage from Matthew 7. First, discrimination helps us identify toxic people. Helps us to identify toxic relations. Jesus says, "Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" I'm a people watcher. I love to watch people, and it amazes me the number of folks who surround themselves with toxic individuals. We're going to talk a little bit more about toxic individuals in a few moments. But Jesus says that we can identify them because the things that they're involved in will not be as they're supposed to be. If you find yourself getting poked by thorns and pricked by thistles in your relationships, you're probably surrounded with some toxic people. Discrimination helps identify toxic people, and discrimination helps us keep it real. Jesus says a good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Albert Einstein said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result." I think Jesus would tell us that if you expect the toxic people in your life to change or do nice things for you, you're nuts. I'm an expert on toxic people. I grew up with one. My paternal grandmother was perhaps the most toxic individual I have ever met in my entire life. You see, my father was a California highway patrolman. He was killed in the line of duty when I was 3 years old, and he was her only son, and I'm her only grandson. And when my grandfather died, I was her only relative. And as she grew older, it became more and more incumbent upon me to do some caretaking for her. So I would call her every so often, and every time I would call my grandmother, she would answer the phone and say, "Well, I haven't heard from you in the longest time. I thought you forgot about me." Well, after a few years of that, I got pretty tired of it, and I did a test. I decided I was going to call her every day for an entire month. And every day I called her, and every day she said, "Well." And after the 31st day of, "Well," I said, "You know what, Grandma? I have called you every single day for a month. How many times do I have to call you before my calls mean something to you?" Well, she hung up on me. The good news is I didn't have to put up with her for a while. But she did everything she could to try and make me feel unimportant. Discrimination helps us keep it real. It helps us to understand that there are toxic people and non-toxic people, and if we expect the toxic people to act in a non-toxic way, we're nuts. Now, the English teachers or former English teachers will appreciate me that much more for this next answer. Discrimination helps us eschew toxic people. For those of you who are not English teachers, eschew means get rid of. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down, Jesus tells us. Jesus didn't simply tell us that we can't expect good things from bad people. He says if there's a tree in our life that's producing bad fruit, we need to cut it down. Toxic people will always be toxic, and we must steer clear of them. We must eschew them from our lives. When I got that first call to the church in Reno, I bought a little house. And it was a brand new house, and it was up on a hill. And if you've never been to Reno before, it's very barren. And the first thing I wanted to do was plant a tree. So I went to the nursery, and I said, look, I need a tree, and I need one that'll grow really fast. He said, well, the fastest growing tree we have is this cottonwood tree over here. So I planted the cottonwood tree. Well, when I left Reno, I kept the house as a rental, and about 10 years later, I got a call from my tenant, and he said, hey, you got to call a tree guy. A gigantic limb just fell out of that tree and almost hit the house. So I called the tree guy, and he said, all right, I'll go over and look at it, and I'll give you a call when I get there. A little while later, he called me laughing, and he said, did you plant this cottonwood tree? And very proudly, I said, yes, it is. Yes, I did. Did you see how tall it is? He said, yeah, not only did I see that, but I saw that it's spitting pitch all over your house and the neighbor's house and the neighbor's car and your car. And in fact, your neighbor told me that he'd pay for half of it if I'd cut the tree down for you. I said, no, I love trees. I don't want to have to cut it down. He said, well, cottonwood trees are notorious for having very small root balls, and we get pretty windy weather up here in Reno, and one of these days it's going to end up through your house. So I cut down the tree. You see, Jesus knew that there are some people in our lives who are going to eventually, like that tree, fall on our lives and destroy them. When an individual, though they might fulfill a need in your life, causes destruction in another way, we need to eschew the toxic person. And finally, discrimination helps us decide when and if to end toxic relationships. Jesus said, every tree that does not bear fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. There are times when we find ourselves in relationships with toxic people that we need to end those relationships permanently for our own good. I'm all for reconciliation, and I'm all for fixing broken relationships, but there are some relationships with some people that cannot and perhaps should not be fixed. Reconciliation is one thing, survival is another. And when the survival of a child of God is at stake, I vote for survival over reconciliation every single time. Well, so how do we do discrimination appropriately? I think Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians in chapter 5, gave us 4 things that we can do to identify and deal with toxic relations. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very difficult issue to deal with. But I think it might even be more difficult to hear. So listen very carefully as we talk about the things that toxic people do so that you might identify those folks in your life that may even be seeking to destroy you. Paul writes, you shouldn't act as if everything is just fine when a friend who claims to be a Christian first is promiscuous or crooked. You see, toxic people cheat. It's almost a compulsion for them. They're almost compelled to deceive. Even when following the rules is easier, they'll go out of their way to cheat just to cheat. There are cottage industries built up around cheating toxic people. I have a buddy who is a private investigator, and he makes about 6 figures a year investigating cheating spouses. And on the other side, there are websites who will help you to cheat. Some get a kind of thrill from this deception, and they'll find any means to gain advantage. When I was at Pacific Lutheran University, I went there because I wanted to go to dental school. But I found out that I transcend dental work. Sorry. But I went there and I took all the pre-med courses, and in my class was this woman. She was 32 years old, ancient by our standards. And she had already earned a doctorate in Spanish. She knew how to do college really well. She had decided that she wanted to take her Spanish language skills and become a medical doctor and go to South America to help indigenous peoples with their illnesses. A wonderful Christian thing. Unless, of course, she's in your class. She was so good at college that she threw the curve way off. In fact, I did some math. I figured if she wasn't in any of my classes, my GPA in college would have been about 3/4 of a point higher. Well, one day I was in an inorganic chemistry class, and we were taking the final, and as was the custom of the professors at PLU, the professor gave us the tests and left the classroom, telling us to put the test on his desk when we left. Well, of course, this Spanish doctorate lady was always the first one done, and she finished the test and put it on his desk and left. And just as I was finishing up my test, another kid in the class finished up and took his test, and when he put it on the professor's desk, he grabbed hers and walked out. Curve problem solved. But I had another problem. It was the honor system at PLU, and I couldn't allow that to go unreported, and neither could several other people in my class. And as a result of his cheating, he got kicked out of the university and lost his opportunity to go to medical school forever. The tragedy is he was a straight A student. He still would have got a 4.0 even if he hadn't taken her test. You see, toxic people cheat. The second thing that I believe that Paul tells us about toxic people is that toxic people are narcissistic. You shouldn't act as if everything is fine when a friend who claims to be a Christian is flip with God or rude to friends. You've all heard about Narcissus. He was the most beautiful young man that was ever born. And the gods told his mother when he was born to never let him see his reflection for fear that he would fall in love with himself. And one day Narcissus was in the woods and he saw his reflection in the pond and fell in love with himself and stayed there adoring himself so long that he starved to death. The psychologists describe narcissism as a mental disorder in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance and a deep need for admiration. They see themselves as more important than anyone else they come into contact with. And it's no problem for them to belittle co-workers or to humiliate family or to crush their children's dreams if it's about keeping them the center of attention. And ultimately, it leads them to seek out those they can prey on because they destroy relationships as they go along. And also because God doesn't clearly intervene to stop them from destroying these relationships, they begin to think that they're even more powerful than God. Narcissism makes them just plain mean and rude to friends. The third thing that toxic people are is toxic people abuse themselves. Paul writes, you shouldn't act as if everything is just fine when a friend who claims to be a Christian gets drunk. In the Old Testament times or New Testament times, there weren't a whole lot of other drugs to abuse except alcohol. Toxic people abuse themselves. They can't always fill the need they feel to be special, and so they'll find other means. They can't always be the most beautiful, so they'll find other means like eating disorders with young women and steroid abuse with young men. Ultimately, the toxic person even discovers that the abuse gets them attention, and so they continue to abuse themselves. And finally, toxic people abuse others. They become greedy and predatory, Paul says. Toxic people not only ruin relationships, they can ruin the people to whom they relate. They're about destroying and hurting people. It's important that we do everything possible to discriminate and identify these toxic people so we can remove them from our lives. Discrimination helps us catch these behaviors early before we get hurt. With professional help, sometimes these folks can be helped. But the reality is that most times they can't be. And they're doing nothing more than trying to destroy you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult thing to preach and it's a difficult thing to hear, but I think it's important because you are amazing. And God created you to be His child, and you deserve to be treated as such. God did not create you to be abused. God created you for love, to be in deep relationship with others, and to experience His love and grace. And I'm convinced that there are millions and millions of Christian people whose lives are destroyed by toxic people because they think they have to put up with them because the Bible says so. I've given you 2 passages this morning where the Bible doesn't say so. In fact, both Paul and Jesus say if you've got those kind of people in your life, kick them out. Not just because you got to get rid of bad people, but because God loves you so much that He wants you to live a joyous